The city of Okinawa had been reduced to rubble, and the hospital that once stood as a symbol of healing and care was now a crumbling relic of its former self. Inside, the rooms were silent except for the occasional cough or faint groan. The walls were cracked and the windows shattered, letting in the suffocating heat of the midday sun. The hospital's halls, which had once echoed with the sounds of life-saving operations and medical chatter, now carried only the heavy silence of the abandoned and the dying.
Among the patients, there were no doctors to oversee their care. The nurses, few in number and nearly as frail as the patients they tended to, had been left to their own devices. The medical supplies were all but gone, and any remaining bandages or medicine had been rationed to the point of uselessness. Some patients, those who were still conscious, lay in their beds staring at the peeling ceiling, waiting for a death that seemed inevitable. Others had slipped into unconsciousness, unable to endure the prolonged suffering caused by hunger, fever, and infection.
The air in the hospital was thick with the smell of decay. The odor of rotting food, sweat, and illness hung heavily in the stagnant atmosphere. The faint smell of disinfectant, once so reassuring, was now only a distant memory. The few remaining nurses and patients did their best to make do, but there was little they could do to stop the inevitable progression of the disease and despair that plagued them all. Time seemed to stretch endlessly within these walls, each passing hour a torment, each new day a grim reminder of how much longer they would have to endure. The hospital had been abandoned by the military, as had much of the city. The Japanese soldiers had retreated, leaving behind civilians, many of whom were too ill or too weak to leave with them. The hospital, once a place of hope, had turned into a sanctuary of despair. The sound of artillery fire from a distance was the only reminder that the war was still raging outside. But within these walls, it felt as though the world had come to a halt. One patient, an elderly man with a thin, paper-like complexion, lay motionless on his bed. His breathing was shallow, his body frail from the months of suffering. He had been here longer than most, his family gone, his mind clouded by fever and exhaustion. There were others like him, old men, women, and children, trapped in the same hopeless situation, left to fade away in a forgotten corner of a forgotten hospital. In the corner of the room, a mother held her child tightly, whispering soft words of comfort that neither of them could hear anymore. Her child, once a bright-eyed boy, was now pale and lifeless, his body weak from starvation and illness. She clutched him desperately, as though she could will him back to health by sheer force of love. But even she knew there was no hope left for them. The war had taken everything from her, her husband, her home, her dignity, and now it was taking her child. The patients had heard the rumors of approaching enemy forces. They had heard the distant sounds of helicopters and the rumble of tanks in the distance. But there was no escape. They were trapped in the hospital, unable to move, unable to fight, and unable to surrender. The idea of surrendering to the Americans was a fate worse than death, according to the propaganda they had been fed for so long. Death was inevitable, but at least it would be on their terms. As the days dragged on, the situation grew worse. Water was running low, and food had been gone for days. The remaining supplies were so scarce that the nurses had begun using anything they could find: torn sheets, scraps of fabric, old bandages, as makeshift dressings. The patients had begun to speak in whispers, their voices hoarse from thirst and fear. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone could feel the heaviness of their situation. And yet, in the midst of the suffering, there was a strange sense of unity. The patients and the nurses, though separated by their roles, had become a community of sorts. They shared what little they had, whether it was a sip of water or a word of comfort.
They held on to each other in silence, knowing that their fates were tied together. But no amount of unity could change the harsh reality that surrounded them. They were alone in the dark, waiting for a salvation that might never come. As the war raged on around Okinawa, American forces were relentlessly pushing forward, advancing closer to the heart of the island. In the early hours of the morning, orders came down from higher command: hold the current position and dig in. Sergeant William Fletcher, a seasoned soldier with years of combat experience, stood with his men on the outskirts of the devastated city, overlooking the remains of what was once a thriving urban area. His orders were clear: no engagement unless absolutely necessary. The soldiers were to maintain their positions, establish a perimeter, and await further orders. Fletcher had seen enough to know that holding this particular stretch of land meant waiting for the inevitable, the oncoming counterattack. The Japanese forces were not ones to give up easily, and he knew that in the coming days the ground around them would become even more dangerous. The stench of smoke and death hung in the air as the soldiers fortified their positions, building makeshift barriers from concrete rubble and wood. It was hard not to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The men settled into their defensive positions with practiced efficiency. Barbed wire was stretched across the remaining streets, and sandbags were stacked high along the edges of their positions. Fletcher's mind raced as he thought about the people who were still trapped in the city, the civilians who had nowhere to go, the wounded who had been left behind. His thoughts turned to the hospital that lay in the distance, the one he had passed by a few days ago. He had seen the faintest glimmer of movement within the broken windows, but his orders were clear: do not engage unless instructed. The thought of those people suffering in the wreckage haunted him. His radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was a message from command: hold your position at all costs. Do not engage with civilians or attempt to offer assistance. Do not move forward unless otherwise directed. The words felt like a slap in the face. Fletcher knew what those orders meant. He was to stand by, to remain in place while lives hung in the balance just a few miles away. It was a stark reminder of the cruel realities of war, where strategic decisions were often made without regard for the lives of those caught in the middle. The silence that followed the radio transmission felt heavier than before. Fletcher looked around at his men, their faces hardened by weeks of brutal fighting. They were tired of the constant shelling, tired of the death, tired of waiting. But more than that, they were human. And deep down, Fletcher knew that humanity still had a place in their hearts, even in the midst of all this destruction. He couldn't shake the image of those patients, helpless and abandoned in the hospital. He had been trained to follow orders, but the thought of doing nothing gnawed at him. In the distance, the sound of artillery fire echoed across the battlefield, reminding Fletcher that the war was not going to stop. His men were preparing for the worst, for the inevitable assault that would come when the Japanese forces regrouped. He was supposed to be a soldier, a leader, someone who knew how to follow the chain of command, but inside he wrestled with his own conscience. Should he just wait and do as he was told, or was there something more he could do? His orders were clear, but his heart told him otherwise. As the sun set and the day's heat began to fade, Fletcher found himself staring out over the ruins of the city, his thoughts still consumed by the hospital. His men had settled into their positions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he needed to do, something that had nothing to do with holding the line. The thought of those who were left behind, struggling to survive in a city that was no longer a city, weighed heavily on him. It was a feeling he couldn't ignore. He was a soldier, but he was also a human being, and in that moment he wasn't sure where his duty ended and his moral compass began. Nightfall brought an eerie calm to the battlefield. The distant sounds of gunfire were now mere echoes, and the usual hum of military chatter had quieted. In the stillness of the night, Fletcher sat alone, gazing out at the ruins, torn between his duty to his men and his instinct to help those who were still suffering. He knew the risks. Stepping out of line could mean death for both him and his men. But he couldn't help but wonder, could there be a way to help without jeopardizing everything? As the cold night air settled around him, Fletcher made a decision. It was time to break the rules. The question was, how would he go about it? And more importantly, would he be able to live with the consequences?
Fletcher's decision to defy orders was not made lightly. As the night stretched on and the weight of his choice settled on him, he knew that his actions could have serious consequences. It wasn't just the risk of court-martial or the potential for his men to follow him into uncertain danger. It was the moral dilemma that had been eating at him. Every moment spent waiting, following the orders to stay put while civilians were left to die, made the walls of the hospital grow higher in his mind. He couldn't ignore the fact that the very people he had sworn to protect were suffering just beyond the horizon. In that moment, Fletcher felt a burning sense of responsibility that overpowered the strict military protocol. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, and Fletcher stood up from his spot, looking at his men as they prepared for another day of waiting. His mind was already made up, but he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and everything could unravel. He gathered his most trusted soldiers, those he knew would follow him without question, and pulled them aside. He explained his plan in quiet tones, his voice low, even though the morning wind carried every word to those nearby. There was no room for hesitation, and he didn't want any of them to second-guess their decision. "We're going in," Fletcher said, his voice calm but resolute. "I know the orders, I know the risks. But those people, those civilians, they need our help. We've been told to hold this line, but I can't just sit by while they die." He paused, looking into the eyes of the soldiers who had seen enough death to fill a lifetime. "I'm going, with or without you. If you want to stay, I'll understand, but I'm asking for your help." One by one, his men nodded. Some were more willing than others, but none of them voiced any objections. Fletcher knew they understood, just as he did, that there was more to this than just following orders. There was something far more important at stake, the lives of those who couldn't fight back. And with that silent agreement, they began to prepare for their journey toward the hospital. As they made their way through the rubble of the city, Fletcher couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. The streets, once filled with the sounds of life, were now eerily empty. The only sounds were the distant rumbles of artillery fire and the occasional crackle of a broken radio. Their movements were cautious but swift. Fletcher kept his eyes peeled for any signs of danger, knowing that they could be spotted at any moment by Japanese soldiers or snipers hidden in the ruins. But his resolve was stronger than his fear. The further they walked, the more determined he became. When they reached the hospital, Fletcher felt a wave of sorrow and relief wash over him. The building was barely standing, its exterior pocked with bullet holes and cracks. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung open, revealing the shadows of the broken interior. They moved carefully, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. Fletcher's heart pounded in his chest as he led his men through the main entrance, his eyes scanning the halls for signs of life. Inside, it was as if the world had come to a standstill. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered. The walls were stained with blood, and the floors were slick with something darker. Fletcher's gaze quickly moved over the rows of beds, some empty, others filled with the gaunt faces of the sick and dying. It was a far cry from the clean, sterile environment that a hospital was supposed to represent. Instead, it had become a grim reminder of the harsh realities of war, where human life was so easily discarded. Fletcher approached the first patient he saw, an elderly woman lying on a bed in the far corner of the room.
Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her, his voice soft as he spoke to her in Japanese. She blinked up at him, confused, her frail body trembling from fever. Her clothes were tattered, her skin pale and stretched tight across her bones. But there was a spark of recognition in her eyes when she saw the American soldiers standing around her, offering her water and clean bandages. "We're here to help," Fletcher said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're safe now." The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she reached out a shaking hand toward Fletcher, a silent plea for more than just medical aid. It was a plea for hope, for the reassurance that there was still humanity left in this world. Fletcher took her hand gently, his heart heavy with the weight of all the suffering he had witnessed. He couldn't change the past, but he could help them survive. As he moved from bed to bed, offering what little comfort he could, the other soldiers began their work. They set up makeshift medical stations, using what limited supplies they had left. They wrapped wounds, fed the weak, and tried to calm the frightened patients. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also a strange sense of peace. They were breaking the rules, but they were doing it for a cause that felt more important than any military order. Fletcher knew the risks, but they were no longer important. The faces of the patients, the frailty of their bodies, and the fear in their eyes filled him with a new purpose. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with it. But in that moment, surrounded by his men and the patients they were helping, Fletcher felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he was doing the right thing. And in the midst of a war where right and wrong often blurred together, that was enough. The hours passed quickly as they worked, and soon the once empty hospital was filled with life. The American soldiers had broken through the walls of fear and uncertainty, offering something that had been absent for far too long: compassion. But Fletcher knew that their actions, though noble, were still dangerous. There was no telling how long they would be allowed to remain undetected, or how long it would take for the higher-ups to realize that they had gone rogue. Yet for the time being, they had done something that could not be undone. They had given hope to those who had none. And in war, that was a victory in itself. As the hours dragged on, Fletcher's resolve strengthened. They had come to the hospital to help, but now the mission had shifted. The heavy weight of their decision to defy orders was settling in. Fletcher knew they could not stay much longer. The building was a ticking time bomb, its walls battered by shell fire, the foundation cracked, and with each passing minute the likelihood of another artillery strike increased. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and Fletcher could feel the pressure mounting. Every moment spent here was a risk, but leaving without evacuating the patients was unthinkable. He gathered his team once more, checking the conditions of the patients. Some were too weak to be moved, too far gone to survive the journey. Others, though barely conscious, could still be helped. Fletcher had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. Moving the patients, especially those in critical condition, would be an immense challenge. There was no way to carry them all, and even if they managed to evacuate some, they would still be vulnerable to gunfire, air raids, or further attacks from the Japanese soldiers. But Fletcher couldn't let them stay behind. "We'll move them in stages," Fletcher decided, his voice low but firm. "We can't carry everyone, but we'll get as many as we can to safety." His men nodded grimly. They understood the gravity of the situation. Fletcher and his team began to work quickly. They fashioned makeshift stretchers from broken wooden beams and cloth, doing their best to secure the injured and the ill. The hospital was still eerily quiet, save for the occasional moan or the shuffle of feet as soldiers moved about. The air felt heavy with both the weight of their mission and the ever-present danger of the unknown. Fletcher could feel the tension in every movement, the sense of urgency building as they prepared to carry out the evacuation. The first patient, a frail woman with a leg injury, was carefully lifted onto a stretcher.
Fletcher and one of the other soldiers gently carried her through the narrow corridors, trying not to jostle her too much. As they reached the entrance, Fletcher hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The once silent hospital now seemed to hum with the threat of imminent danger. They could still hear the distant sounds of artillery and machine gun fire in the background. Every second felt like an eternity as they waited for the signal to move. The soldiers outside had begun to fortify their positions further, preparing for the potential of a counterattack. Fletcher knew they couldn't waste any more time. They needed to move, and they needed to move fast. He gave the signal to his men, and they began to move the first group of patients out of the building. They were exposed, vulnerable, but there was no turning back now. The outside world was far worse than Fletcher had imagined. The streets that had once been bustling with life were now reduced to a war-torn wasteland, littered with debris and broken buildings. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the distant rumble of explosions echoed in the background. Fletcher's men moved quickly, their eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of enemy forces. Every step felt like a gamble. Every moment spent outside the relative safety of the hospital was a risk. As the patients were carried across the open street, Fletcher's pulse quickened. He could see the faintest movements of soldiers in the distance, Japanese forces who had yet to retreat. The last thing they needed was to be spotted now. The soldiers moved in a staggered formation, trying to blend in with the shadows, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Fletcher felt the weight of responsibility with each step. He was not just protecting his men, he was protecting the lives of these civilians, the very people he had been ordered to leave behind. The first round of evacuations was successful, but the work was far from over. As they reached the edge of the city, the danger only escalated. The soldiers had to navigate through narrow alleyways and past abandoned vehicles, constantly on the lookout for enemy snipers or hidden soldiers. The heat of the day was starting to take its toll on the men, and the exhaustion was beginning to show on their faces. But they pushed on. There was no turning back. Fletcher was in the rear, keeping an eye on the progress of the evacuation. As he turned a corner, he saw something that made his stomach twist. One of the patients had slipped from their stretcher and fallen to the ground. A soldier was kneeling beside them, trying to lift them back onto the stretcher. Fletcher rushed over, his heart racing. He knew that stopping meant exposing themselves to even greater danger. But they couldn't leave anyone behind, not now. "Get her up, quickly," Fletcher urged, his voice sharp. "We don't have time to waste." His men responded with urgency, lifting the patient back up and securing her once again. It was a close call, but they were able to get her back in motion without attracting attention. Fletcher's nerves were shot, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As they moved further into the wilderness, away from the battlefield, the urgency began to fade. The soldiers were tired, their bodies aching from the relentless effort of carrying the wounded, but there was a sense of relief now that they were out of immediate danger. The evacuation had been successful. They had managed to get the most vulnerable patients to safety. Fletcher knew that the war was far from over, but for now they had done something right. They had made a choice that went beyond orders and duty. They had saved lives. Looking back at the hospital, Fletcher allowed himself a moment of reflection. The building, now fading into the distance, was no longer just a symbol of suffering. It was a place where lives had been saved, where the impossible had been achieved against all odds. They had defied the orders, they had taken the risk, and they had made a difference. For Fletcher, that was a victory, one that would stay with him long after the war had ended. The first light of dawn broke over the landscape, casting a soft golden hue across the valley where Fletcher and his men had set up camp. The area was quiet now, but the remnants of battle were everywhere. Broken tanks and rusted vehicles lined the roadside, and the distant sound of artillery was a constant reminder that the war was still ongoing. Yet, for the first time in what felt like ages, Fletcher allowed himself to breathe.
The patients they had evacuated were now safely away from the front line, settled in makeshift tents and medical facilities. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional toll of what they had just accomplished began to sink in. The camp had become a sanctuary of sorts, a strange island of calm amidst the chaos of war. As the wounded patients were attended to by American medics, there was a flicker of hope that hadn't existed before. The soldiers, exhausted from days of intense combat and the risky evacuation, now found themselves in the role of caregivers. It was a stark shift from the battlefield, but one that felt, in many ways, more humanizing. Fletcher, who had spent so many months in the trenches fighting for survival, found himself talking to the patients more than he ever had before. The language barrier was a challenge, but the universal need for comfort and care transcended words. One of the first things Fletcher noticed was how many of the patients, despite their frailty, began to show signs of life again. The children especially were the first to recover. Their laughter, tentative at first, filled the camp, lifting the spirits of the soldiers who had been hardened by the brutality of war. It was difficult to reconcile the image of these children playing with the knowledge of what they had just survived. Fletcher had seen the devastation the war caused, but to witness the innocence of these children finding joy again was nothing short of miraculous. The soldiers, who had been taught to view the Japanese people as enemies, now found themselves tending to these survivors with empathy they hadn't thought possible. Fletcher sat by a fire one evening, watching the children run and play in the dirt. A small girl approached him hesitantly, holding out a piece of chocolate she had been given by one of the medics. She offered it to him with a shy smile, her face covered in dirt, but her eyes sparkling with something that had been lost in the war: hope. Fletcher took the piece from her, his heart heavy with emotion. He had been through countless battles, had seen death up close, but this moment, this small act of kindness, was a reminder of everything that could still be salvaged from the ashes of war. In the days that followed, more and more of the patients began to regain strength. The soldiers worked tirelessly, providing what comfort and care they could, even if it was just a simple meal or a few words of encouragement. But for Fletcher, the most profound change came when one of the former patients, a woman in her 40s who had been severely wounded during the battle, took it upon herself to help with the younger children. Her body was weak from the trauma she had endured, but her spirit was unbroken. She began to teach the children simple words in Japanese, and in turn, some of the American soldiers, like Private Thomas Murphy, started to teach the children basic English phrases. The exchange of language, though simple, became a powerful tool for building bridges between the soldiers and the survivors. It was no longer a matter of combatants on opposing sides. It was a matter of shared humanity. The American soldiers, who had once viewed their Japanese adversaries as nothing more than enemies, now found themselves in the awkward but meaningful position of caretakers and teachers. They had been taught to fear the Japanese, to see them as faceless soldiers, but now they were learning that the people they had fought against were just that, people. People who had suffered just as they had. Despite the growing bond between the two groups, there were moments of tension. Some of the soldiers still carried the weight of their experiences on the front lines, and their mistrust of the civilians was hard to shake. They had lost friends, brothers in arms, to the very people they were now helping. The transition from enemies to helpers was not an easy one, and there were still those who viewed the survivors with suspicion. But these moments of doubt were becoming fewer as the days passed, replaced by a quiet understanding that transcended the horrors of the battlefield. One afternoon, Fletcher was walking through the camp when he overheard a conversation between two soldiers, one of whom had been adamant about not helping the Japanese civilians. The other soldier, a younger man who had been in the fight for less than a year, was telling him about a small girl who had thanked him for giving her food. "She didn't have to say it," the younger soldier said, his voice soft, "but she did, and it made me feel, I don't know, like I did something right." Fletcher stopped in his tracks, hearing the shift in the tone of his men. The walls were beginning to come down, brick by brick. The bitterness of war was still there, but now there was space for something new: understanding. By the end of the week, the camp had taken on a sense of normalcy, a fragile peace that felt both surreal and necessary. Fletcher watched as the soldiers interacted with the survivors, not as enemies, but as human beings. They shared meals, exchanged stories, and at times even laughed together. The healing process, both physical and emotional, had begun. The patients who had been so close to death were now sitting up, eating regular meals, and even attempting to walk. The soldiers, too, were recovering. The mental toll of war was still heavy, but it was easier to bear when there was hope on the horizon. As Fletcher stood by the fire one evening, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, he thought back to the moment when he had made the decision to go against orders. At the time, it had seemed like a small act, an impossible choice. But now, standing in the camp, surrounded by survivors and soldiers alike, he realized how much it had changed them all. It wasn't just the patients who had been saved. It was everyone who had taken part in this moment of humanity. For Fletcher, this was the real victory, one that couldn't be measured in enemy casualties or territory gained, but in the lives that had been preserved and the humanity that had been rediscovered. In a world defined by violence, they had found a way to heal. As the weeks passed, the once silent camp transformed into a place where life began to thrive again. The survivors, who had once been mere shadows of their former selves, were now beginning to regain some semblance of normalcy. The American soldiers, too, found themselves adjusting to this new role. They had come to Oklahoma to fight a war, but they had ended up saving lives instead. The realization was both humbling and overwhelming. Each day, they worked together, soldiers and civilians, toward the shared goal of survival. And in the process, they found that they had forged bonds that no battle could destroy. The children, who had been so traumatized by the war, began to play again. Fletcher watched one afternoon as a small group of Japanese children ran and laughed in the field, their faces bright with the innocence that war had tried to strip away. For a brief moment, the camp seemed almost like any other place where people were simply trying to get by. The joy of the children was infectious, and even the most hardened soldiers found themselves smiling at the sight of it. The laughter, once stifled by fear and pain, now rang out freely, echoing through the camp like a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit. The medical teams continued their work, but the once debilitating injuries were now treated with the care and attention they deserved. The medics, who had been stretched to their limits during the evacuation and the initial days in the camp, now had the resources to perform surgeries, administer antibiotics, and provide the proper care. Some of the civilians, who had once been too weak to sit up, were now able to walk, talk, and even smile. Fletcher observed it all with a mixture of awe and pride. What they had accomplished, against all odds, was nothing short of miraculous. But even in the midst of this progress, there was a lingering sense of unease. The soldiers, despite the bonds they had forged with the survivors, knew that their mission was not yet complete. There was still the matter of the enemy, still the knowledge that the war was far from over. Some soldiers, particularly those who had seen the worst of the combat, struggled with the idea of helping those they had once considered enemies. They had been taught to see the Japanese as an obstacle, an enemy to be destroyed. But here they were, providing care, protection, and even comfort. The cognitive dissonance was hard to shake. Fletcher, however, had found a sense of peace in the work they were doing. He no longer saw the survivors as enemies. He saw them as people who had been caught in the same storm of violence and chaos as the soldiers themselves. In helping them, Fletcher had come to realize that he was not just saving lives, but redeeming his own humanity. He had chosen to act against orders, to make a difference when it seemed impossible, and in doing so, he had found a new purpose in the midst of the war. One day, as Fletcher was walking through the camp, he noticed a small group of civilians gathered around a makeshift fire. The woman who had taken it upon herself to care for the children approached him, her face lined with exhaustion, but also with a quiet strength that he had come to admire. She handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, he found a hand-carved wooden figurine, a symbol of peace, made from the scraps of wood that had been lying around the camp. The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with gratitude. "For you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. Fletcher was taken aback. He had never expected to receive anything in return for the work they had done. In fact, he had never expected anything from anyone. But this small gesture, this simple token of appreciation, struck him deeply. It was a symbol of trust, of respect, and of the profound impact their actions had had on the people they had helped. It was a reminder that, even in the most brutal of circumstances, acts of kindness could still flourish. As the days wore on, the camp began to feel like a new home for the survivors. They had been stripped of everything: homes, families, possessions, but in this small corner of the world they were rebuilding their lives. Fletcher watched as the community took shape, as the civilians began to find their own roles within the camp. Some of the women who had once been nurses began helping with the medical work. The men, once soldiers, now worked together to improve the conditions of the camp, building shelters, creating makeshift gardens, and organizing the children into small groups for lessons. There was a sense of unity that had not existed before. The barriers between the soldiers and the civilians were slowly dissolving. They had started as enemies, but now they were something else entirely. They were survivors, united by the shared experience of war, but also by the shared experience of healing. And in that healing, there was a powerful sense of redemption, for both the civilians and the soldiers. In the weeks that followed, Fletcher couldn't help but reflect on the decision he had made. At the time, it had seemed like a small act, a momentary lapse in following orders. But now, looking at the faces of the survivors, watching them laugh, work, and rebuild, he understood that it was much more than that. It had been a turning point, not just for the people they had saved, but for himself and his men. They had broken through the walls of hatred and fear, and in doing so, they had discovered a deeper, more profound connection to one another. Fletcher stood by the fire that evening, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky. The camp was quiet now, with only the soft murmurs of conversation and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. He thought about how far they had come since that fateful night when he had made the decision to act. They had saved lives, yes, but they had also found something much greater: humanity, compassion, and the ability to see beyond the uniform and the enemy. As he looked around at the camp, now filled with life and hope, Fletcher knew that this moment, this choice, would stay with him long after the war had ended. It was not the victories on the battlefield that would define them, but the moments of mercy, the acts of kindness, and the realization that, even in the darkest of times, light could still break through. And that was something worth fighting for.